Last time, we followed the money into the world's largest asset manager, to who quietly holds it. We promised to follow it one step further, to the switch that can shut it off. Here is the first surprise. A sanction is not a wall built around a country. No border is closed, no ship is sunk. It is simpler and stranger than that. A sanction is the United States deciding who is allowed to use the dollar. That is the whole weapon. And it works for one reason. Nearly the entire world runs on dollars. By choice. But hold on to that word, choice, because it is also why sanctions leak like a sieve. You can decide who may use your currency. You cannot force the world to keep choosing it. So this is a two-sided story. First, we build the weapon, part by part, and watch it fire at full power. Then we show you, with the numbers, why again and again it fails to land. By the end, you will understand how the switch really works and where it is quietly wearing out, better than almost anyone who argues about it online.
Start with the question the whole weapon rests on. Why the dollar? Why can one country's currency become a lever over the entire globe? The answer is three numbers. First, savings. As of the end of 2025, the dollar made up about 57% of all the foreign currency reserves the world's central banks hold, more than double the euro's roughly 20% and many times the Chinese yuan's 2%. Second, payments. Of all the cross-border payments moving across the main international messaging network, the dollar carries around half. The euro, in second place, is not close. Third, and most striking, trading. As of the spring of 2025, the dollar sat on one side of nearly 90% of every foreign exchange trade on Earth. Not a third, not half, nearly 9 in 10. Put those three together, and you get the sentence this whole video turns on. Because almost every cross-border deal eventually needs dollars, and dollars can only truly be settled through the American banking system, whoever controls access to that system controls access to global trade. That control is the weapon. It was never really built. It was simply there, the moment the world chose the dollar. So where, physically, is the switch? To find it, follow a single dollar. Picture a bank in Cairo or Jakarta that needs to pay for goods in dollars. Here is the catch almost no one outside banking knows. That bank cannot simply hold dollars at the US Federal Reserve. It has no account there. To touch the dollar at all, it needs a partner inside the American system, a correspondent bank, an account at a bank under US jurisdiction that moves the dollars on its behalf. And when those dollars actually move, they clear through two American rails. One is the Federal Reserve's own system, Fedwire. The other is a private network called CHIPS, run by the largest US banks, which settles about $2.2 trillion a day and handles roughly 95% of all cross-border dollar payments. Sit with that. Nearly every dollar that crosses a border passes through a bank standing on US soil under US law. That is the choke point. That is where the switch physically lives. And it explains why sanctions bite in dollars specifically. Not because Washington can seize euros or yuan, which it usually cannot, but because the dollar's plumbing runs through its own backyard.
Now we can name the hand on the switch. It has an address, and a dull one. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, a unit inside the US Treasury, usually shortened to OFAC. OFAC administers the sanctions. It decides who gets cut off, and it enforces the rules on every bank that touches the dollar. Its main instrument is a list. It is called the Specially Designated Nationals List, the SDN list, and landing on it is close to a financial death sentence. Once you are named, in effect, every US person and every US-touching bank must freeze your assets and stop dealing with you. Cut off from correspondence, your dollars have nowhere to clear. And that list has grown enormously. By the Treasury's own review, the number of sanctioned parties climbed from around 900 in the year 2000 to more than 9,000 by 2021.
Today, it runs to well over 12,000 entries. But here is a nuance the headlines miss. It is not a single on-off switch. Some sanctions are what is called blocking, full, radioactive, all dealings frozen. Others are narrower, aimed at one industry or one kind of financing. And OFAC can issue licenses, carve-outs for food, for medicine, for winding a business down. It is less a light switch than a dial, and that dial matters for everything that follows.
Now for the piece almost everyone gets wrong. You have heard the phrase, "we cut them off from SWIFT," spoken as if SWIFT were the money itself, the vault, the kill command. It is none of those things. SWIFT is a messaging network. Picture the banking world's telephone line. Founded in 1973, based in Belgium, owned by its own member banks, it connects about 11,000 institutions across more than 200 countries. And all it does is carry standardized instructions between them. Pay this amount from this account to that one. The money itself never moves through SWIFT. It moves on the rails we just traced. So cutting a bank off SWIFT does not seize a single dollar. It removes its phone line. The bank can still move money by email, through another network, just slower, clumsier, at higher cost. And there is a second nuance. Because SWIFT sits in Belgium, disconnecting a bank is legally a European decision, usually made under heavy American pressure, not a switch the United States flips alone. History shows both the power and the reversibility. Sanctioned Iranian banks were disconnected in 2012, reconnected in 2016 after a nuclear deal, then cut off again in 2018. And in 2022, 7 Russian banks were removed, while the banks handling energy payments were, at first, deliberately left connected, because Europe still needed the gas. That selectivity is itself the lesson. Even at full stretch, the switch is rarely thrown all the way.
So far, everything binds American persons and American banks. But the dollar's real reach comes from a second mechanism, the one that turns a national rulebook into a global one. It is called secondary sanctions, and it works by offering a choice to a bank or a company in any third country, in Europe, in Asia, anywhere. Washington says, in effect, you may do business with the sanctioned target, or you may keep your access to the US financial system, but not both. Put that choice to any global bank, and the answer is not close. No firm will trade a modest slice of business for exile from the dollar, the currency that clears most of the planet's trade. And so US sanctions become extraterritorial without a single foreign court ever ruling. There is a landmark example of how sharp the teeth are. In 2014, the French bank BNP Paribas pleaded guilty and paid about $8.9 billion, the largest penalty of its kind, for routing dollar transactions through the American system on behalf of sanctioned parties. That number sent a message every bank on earth heard. Since then, the biggest banks do not just follow the rules, they overcomply, avoiding anything that even looks close to a sanctioned target. That quiet fear, more than any single designation, is where much of the weapon's real power actually lives.
To see the tool at full power, look at one recent case, purely as machinery, with no verdict on any country's choices. In early 2022, within days, the world's wealthiest governments moved against the Russian central bank's reserves. A central bank keeps a rainy day fund abroad, parked in other countries' currencies and securities. But those holdings sit inside the sanctioning bloc's own vaults. So roughly $300 billion of Russia's reserves, about half of its $600 billion total, were frozen almost instantly, much of it immobilized at a single Belgian securities depository. The lesson is stark. Reserves held in your rival's currency can become your rival's hostage overnight. Then came a subtler tool, aimed at oil. Simply banning Russian crude would have sent global prices soaring, punishing the very countries imposing the ban. So the coalition tried a different approach, a price cap. Western shippers and insurers could keep serving Russian oil, but only if it sold at or below a set price, originally $60 a barrel, and since lowered further by the European-led coalition.
The design aimed to keep the oil flowing while capping the profit. Whether it actually worked is the question we turn to now, because this is exactly where the weapon starts to leak.
Here is the half of the story the loud voices almost never tell. For all that reach, sanctions fail more often than they succeed. Start with the record. The most cited study in the field, across more than 170 cases over the past century, found sanctions even partly successful, only about a third of the time, and usually on modest goals, rarely anything as large as changing a government. And that is the optimistic reading. One prominent critique put real success closer to 5%. Newer datasets land nearer 40%. So the honest answer is a range, not a number. Somewhere from under 10% to about 40%, depending on how you count. And almost never enough on their own to bring down a regime. Why so leaky? Because you can deny access to your currency, but you cannot force the world to stop trading. So the trade reroutes. Oil that cannot be sold openly moves on a shadow fleet of aging tankers, its origin disguised at sea through ship-to-ship transfers. Goods pass through a third country and get rebadged. Payments run through front companies, through barter, at the margins, through crypto. The barrel does not stay in the ground, it just changes its address. And there is a human dimension the numbers can hide. Sanctions often fall hardest on ordinary civilians, while the targeted elite adapts. And outside pressure can rally a population around its leaders, rather than against them. These are documented patterns, not a verdict on anyone, but they are why the switch so often flips and the lights stay on. There is one more limit, and it is the deepest, because the weapon slowly wears out the very thing that makes it work. The dollar is powerful because the world chooses it, but every time that choice is used as a weapon, everyone watching gets one more reason to build an escape route that cannot be switched off. So rivals have started building. China runs its own cross-border payment network, called CIPS. Russia built a messaging alternative to SWIFT. Others talk of trading in local currencies. This is real, and it is growing. But here is where honesty matters most, because this is exactly where the doom stories lose the thread. These alternatives are not a replacement, they are a distant second. China's network moves on the order of $90 billion a day. The American rail it is built to rival moves about $2.2 trillion. The challenger is running at roughly 4% of the incumbent. The yuan is around 2% of global reserves, and much of that Chinese network still leans on SWIFT's own messaging to work at all. The dollar's share of reserves is drifting down slowly, not collapsing. So the accurate frame is neither triumph nor doom. The dollar is dominant today, and will be for a long time. But the power is finite, and every use of the weapon quietly speeds the search for the exit. Serious scholars, in books with titles like Backfire and Bucking the Buck, argue that overuse itself could be the one thing that eventually erodes the dollar's reign. It is a genuine debate, not a settled fact. The switch works. It is also, very slowly, teaching the world to build a switch of its own.
So put both halves on the table. The dollar switch is real. Through OFAC and the SDN list, across the dollar clearing rails, amplified worldwide by secondary sanctions, one country really can cut a target out of much of the global economy and, with allies, freeze its reserves and pull its phone line. That power is genuine and enormous. But its limit is written into the very same fact that gives it force. The dollar rules because the world chose it. And you can control who uses your currency, but you cannot force the world to keep choosing it. So the oil finds a new address, the trade finds a new route. And by the most honest count, sanctions reach even partial success only about a third of the time. The power is real. So are the limits. And the deepest limit is the one the weapon builds itself. Every time the switch is thrown, the rest of the world gets one more reason to wire around it. One necessary note, the same as always. This has been an explanation of how the financial system works, not investment advice,
and not a political verdict on any country. The figures are dated and sourced. The question worth carrying forward is not how strong the dollar weapon is today. It is how long any weapon stays powerful once the whole world is quietly building its way around it. And that is where we follow the money next, to the challengers, and to what could actually end the dollar's long reign. This has been Money and Power Explained. Follow the money. It always leads to power.